The autumn leaves were falling across the Tennessee Valley in October 1978, painting the streets of Huntsville, Alabama, in shades of amber and rust. The city, known as the Rocket City for its crucial role in America's space program, was a place where scientists and engineers walked alongside cotton farmers and factory workers. It was a community that prided itself on looking toward the future, building rockets that would touch the stars. But that October, something happened that would haunt Huntsville for decades, a shadow that no amount of progress could erase. On the morning of October 14th, the temperature had dropped overnight, bringing with it the first real chill of the season. Fog rolled through the valley, thick and gray, clinging to the ground like a heavy blanket. It was the kind of morning where visibility was poor, where the familiar became strange, where anything could hide in the mist. Patricia Holbrook was supposed to open the library that morning. She was 23 years old, a recent graduate from the University of Alabama in Huntsville with a degree in literature. Everyone who knew her described Patricia the same way: kind, thoughtful, always with a book in her hand and a smile on her face. She had grown up in Huntsville, the daughter of a machinist who worked at the arsenal and a school teacher who had taught half the children in Madison County. Patricia was the kind of person who remembered your birthday, who brought soup when you were sick, who never had an unkind word to say about anyone. She lived in a small apartment on the east side of town, not far from the library where she worked. Her roommate, a nurse named Diane, worked night shifts at the hospital and was usually asleep when Patricia left for work each morning. On October 13th, Diane had seen Patricia before heading to her shift, and everything had seemed normal. Patricia had been reading at the kitchen table, planning the upcoming children's story hour at the library. But on the morning of October 14th, Patricia never made it to work. The library director, Mrs. Eleanor Garrison, arrived at 8:30 to find the doors still locked. This was unusual. Patricia was never late. She was the type who arrived 15 minutes early, who took pride in being reliable. Mrs. Garrison waited, assuming perhaps Patricia's car had trouble starting in the cold. But by 9 o'clock, with no phone call and no sign of the young librarian, concern began to creep into Eleanor's mind. She called Patricia's apartment. No answer. She called Patricia's parents. They hadn't heard from their daughter since the previous evening when she had called to chat about a book she was reading. Now, real worry set in, a cold knot of fear that settled in the stomach and wouldn't leave. Patricia's father, Donald Holbrook, immediately drove to his daughter's apartment. He knocked, called out, used the spare key Patricia had given him for emergencies. The apartment was quiet. Patricia's car was gone from its usual spot. Her bed was made. A coffee cup sat in the sink. Everything looked normal, as if she had simply left for work, as she did every other morning. But Patricia Holbrook had vanished. The Huntsville Police Department began their investigation immediately. In a city of this size, a missing young woman was serious business. Detective Raymond Foster was assigned to the case, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness and a gentle demeanor that put frightened families at ease. He began with the basics, interviewing family, friends, co-workers, anyone who might have seen Patricia or knew her routine. What emerged was a portrait of a woman with no enemies, no secret life, no reason to disappear. She wasn't running from debt or a troubled relationship. She had no history of mental health crises. She was simply a young woman who loved books and wanted to help children discover the joy of reading. But someone knew something. Someone had to. The search intensified. Volunteers combed the parks and wooded areas around Huntsville. Flyers with Patricia's photograph appeared on every telephone pole and shop window. Her picture was in the newspaper, a senior photo showing her bright smile and hopeful eyes. The community rallied, as communities do in times of crisis, united in the hope that Patricia would be found safe. 3 days after Patricia disappeared, a jogger running along the banks of the Flint River just outside the city limits noticed something unusual, partially hidden in the brush near the water's edge. At first he thought it might be a discarded tarp or a bundle of clothing, but as he got closer, his heart began to race. He could see blonde hair, a pale hand. It was Patricia Holbrook. She had been found, but not in the way anyone had hoped. The young librarian who had left for work 3 mornings ago would never come home. The medical examination would later reveal that she had experienced severe trauma, though the exact details were kept from the public to protect the ongoing investigation and spare her family further anguish. What was clear was that Patricia's final hours had had been filled with terror, and that someone had taken everything from her. The discovery sent shockwaves through Huntsville. This wasn't supposed to happen here, not in this forward-thinking city where people built the future. Parents held their children closer. Women began traveling in groups. Locks were checked twice, 3 times before bed. Fear had come to the Rocket City, and it wore the face of an unknown predator. Detective Foster worked around the clock. He interviewed everyone who had been in the vicinity of Patricia's apartment building on the morning she disappeared. He spoke with her regular customers at the library, her professors from the university, old boyfriends, casual acquaintances. He created timelines, mapped routes, searched for any connection, any thread that might lead to the person responsible. There were a few potential leads. A witness reported seeing a dark-colored sedan, possibly a Chevrolet, parked near Patricia's apartment building early on the morning of October 14th. Another person mentioned seeing what might have been Patricia's yellow Volkswagen Beetle heading south on Memorial Parkway around 7:45 that morning, though they couldn't be certain it was her car. A gas station attendant recalled a nervous-looking man in his 30s buying cigarettes around that time, but the description was vague. Average height, brown hair, nothing distinguishing. The investigation pursued each lead with determination. Patricia's car was found 2 days after her body was discovered, abandoned in a grocery store parking lot on the south side of town. It had been wiped clean. No fingerprints, no evidence, nothing that could point to who had driven it there or why. Forensic technology in 1978 was limited compared to what would come later. There was no DNA testing available to local police departments. Fingerprint analysis was helpful only if you had a suspect's prints to compare. Witness testimony was crucial. But in this case, there seemed to be no witnesses to the actual crime, only fragments of possibilities, maybes, and might-have-beens. Weeks turned into months. The police followed every tip, no matter how small. They looked at known offenders in the area, anyone with a history of violence against women. They investigated transients who might have passed through Huntsville that October. They considered the possibility that Patricia had known her attacker, that it might have been someone she trusted enough to approach. But the case grew cold. By the spring of 1979, the active investigation had slowed. Detective Foster never closed the file completely. He kept Patricia's photo on his desk, a reminder of the justice he had failed to deliver. But new cases came, demanding attention, and the trail that had once been warm had gone completely cold. Patricia's parents held a memorial service on what would have been her 24th birthday. They established a scholarship in her name at the university, ensuring that her love of learning would help other young people pursue their dreams. They tried to move forward, though anyone who knew them could see the weight they carried, the way grief had carved itself into their faces. The years passed. The 1980s came and went. The space shuttle program brought new energy and prosperity to Huntsville. The city grew, modernized, changed, but there were still people who remembered Patricia Holbrook, who wondered what had happened to the young librarian with the bright smile. Detective Foster retired in 1995, but he took copies of Patricia's case file with him, unable to let go completely. He would occasionally review the evidence, hoping that with fresh eyes or new perspective, he might see something he had missed. But the answers remained elusive, hidden in the fog of time. The case file was eventually transferred to the Cold Case Division, where it sat among hundreds of other unsolved crimes, each one representing a life interrupted, a family left with questions, a community's sense of safety shattered. But cold cases have a way of warming up when you least expect it. In 2018, 40 years after Patricia Holbrook's disappearance, the Huntsville Police Department received a grant to apply modern forensic technology to cold cases. DNA testing had advanced dramatically since the 1970s. What had once been impossible was now routine. Evidence that had seemed useless decades ago could now tell stories that had been hidden in genetic code. Detective Sarah Chen was assigned to review the old cases and determine which ones might benefit from new testing. She was young, hungry, and determined to bring closure to families who had been waiting for decades. When she pulled Patricia Holbrook's file, she was struck by several things: the thoroughness of the original investigation, the clear care that Detective Foster had taken with the case, and the fact that biological evidence had been preserved. In 1978, the investigators had collected evidence from Patricia's clothing and from beneath her fingernails, hoping it might one day be useful. They had been remarkably forward-thinking, preserving samples that seemed to have little value at the time. Now, 40 years later, that foresight was about to pay off. Detective Chen submitted the samples for DNA testing. The process took months, but when the results came back, they showed a clear profile of an unknown male. This profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and unsolved crimes. And there was a match. The DNA belonged to a man named Leonard Whitfield, a 72-year-old retired electrician living in a quiet neighborhood in South Huntsville. He had lived in the area his entire life, working for various contractors and eventually starting his own small electrical business. He was married, a father of 3, a grandfather of 7. His neighbors described him as quiet, helpful, the kind of man who would fix your wiring for free if you were elderly or struggling financially. The match in CODIS came from a seemingly unrelated incident. In 2015, Leonard had been arrested for a minor assault charge after getting into an altercation at a bar. The charges had eventually been dropped, but his DNA had been collected and entered into the system as part of standard procedure. He had no other criminal record, nothing that would have flagged him as a violent offender. Detective Chen could hardly believe what she was seeing. She triple-checked the results, consulted with the lab, reviewed the chain of custody for the evidence. Everything checked out. The DNA found on Patricia Holbrook's clothing in 1978 belonged to Leonard Whitfield. But DNA alone doesn't tell the whole story. Detective Chen needed more. She began a careful, quiet investigation into Leonard's life, both past and present. She obtained his work records from 1978 and discovered something chilling. Leonard had been working as an electrician at the very library where Patricia worked. He had been there in the weeks before her disappearance, upgrading the building's electrical system. He would have known Patricia. He would have seen her at work, spoken with her, perhaps even helped her with something. And Patricia, being the kind person she was, would have been friendly, grateful for his help, never suspecting that the quiet electrician might pose any danger. Detective Chen dug deeper. She found that in 1978, Leonard had lived in an apartment less than 2 miles from Patricia's. He drove a dark Chevrolet sedan, matching the vague description from the witness report. He smoked cigarettes. Every piece of circumstantial evidence seemed to fit, like puzzle pieces that had been scattered for 4 decades finally coming together. But there was more to uncover. Detective Chen discovered that Leonard had moved to Florida in 1981, staying there for nearly 15 years before returning to Huntsville in the mid-1990s. She contacted law enforcement agencies in the Florida counties where he had lived, asking if there were any unsolved cases involving young women during that time period. The response sent chills down her spine. In 1985, a 25-year-old woman named Jennifer Carson had disappeared from her apartment in Pensacola, Florida. Her body was found a week later in a wooded area. The case had never been solved, but evidence had been preserved. In 1989, another young woman, Rachel Morrison, had vanished from a shopping mall in Jacksonville. Her case remained unsolved as well, with no body ever recovered. Leonard Whitfield had been living in Pensacola in 1985. He had moved to Jacksonville in 1988. Detective Chen coordinated with Florida investigators to compare DNA evidence from the Jennifer Carson case with Leonard's profile. It would take time, but the implications were staggering. What had started as one cold case from 1978 was potentially connecting to other crimes, other victims, other families who had been waiting for answers. The investigation had to be handled with extreme care. Leonard Whitfield was still living in Huntsville, still going about his daily life, completely unaware that the past was catching up to him. Detective Chen couldn't risk tipping him off before they had built an airtight case. She interviewed people who had known Leonard in the 1970s, being careful not to reveal the true nature of her inquiries. Former co-workers described him as competent but unremarkable, a loner who didn't socialize much outside of work. His wife, whom he had married in 1980, seemed to know little about his life before their marriage. He had told her he preferred not to dwell on the past, that he wanted to focus on building a future with her. One former neighbor from Leonard's 1978 apartment building provided a crucial piece of information. She remembered that Leonard had seemed agitated in the days following Patricia's disappearance, that he had suddenly decided to paint his apartment and replace his carpeting, claiming he wanted a fresh start. At the time, it had seemed like an odd reaction to a community tragedy, but not necessarily suspicious. Now, 40 years later, it took on a darker significance. Detective Chen presented her findings to the district attorney. The DNA evidence was solid. The circumstantial evidence was compelling. The potential connections to other cases made it clear that Leonard Whitfield needed to be stopped, if not for what he had done, then for what he might still do. In March 2023, 44 years and 5 months after Patricia Holbrook disappeared on her way to work, police arrived at Leonard Whitfield's home with an arrest warrant. It was early morning, the fog once again rolling through the Tennessee Valley, just as it had on that October day in 1978. Leonard answered the door in his bathrobe, a cup of coffee in his hand. His wife stood behind him, confused and frightened. The grandfather who had built tree houses for his grandchildren, who had volunteered to wire the church's new community center, who had seemed like a pillar of quiet reliability, was informed that he was under arrest for what the law delicately referred to as the unlawful taking of a life. The arrest shocked the community. Leonard's neighbors couldn't believe it. His family was devastated, insisting there had been a terrible mistake. How could this gentle, quiet man who had lived among them for decades be responsible for such a horrific act? But the evidence didn't lie. As more details emerged through legal proceedings, a darker picture of Leonard Whitfield came into focus. Investigators discovered that he had kept newspaper clippings about Patricia's case hidden in a box in his attic. They found journals that suggested a troubled mind, obsessive thoughts about women, fantasies about control and power. These items had been seized during a search of his home, each one adding weight to the case against him. The Florida cases were being re-examined. While those investigations were still ongoing, the similarities were too significant to ignore. Detective Chen believed that Patricia Holbrook might have been Leonard's first victim, that he had spent the years after her passing perfecting his methods, learning from his mistakes, becoming more careful. The trial, when it eventually took place, brought Patricia's story back into the public consciousness. Her parents, now in their 80s, attended every day, sitting in the front row, finally seeing the face of the man who had taken their daughter from them. Donald Holbrook, Patricia's father, would later say that he had spent 44 years imagining what the person who hurt his daughter might look like, might sound like. He had pictured a monster. Instead, he saw an ordinary-looking old man, someone who could have been anyone's grandfather, someone who had hidden in plain sight for decades. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the circumstantial connections, the timeline that placed Leonard at the library where Patricia worked, living near where she lived, driving a car matching witness descriptions. They presented the evidence found in his home, the unsettling journals, the newspaper clippings. They painted a picture of a man who had lived a double life, outwardly normal, inwardly dark. Leonard's defense argued that DNA evidence alone wasn't enough, that the circumstantial evidence was just that, circumstantial, that the journals and clippings proved nothing about what had happened on October 14, 1978. They suggested that perhaps Leonard had been obsessed with the case because he had worked at the library, because he had known Patricia, because the tragedy had affected him deeply. They portrayed him as a man who had lived a good life, who had contributed to his community, whose arrest in his 70s was a miscarriage of justice. But the jury saw through the defense's arguments. After 3 days of deliberation, they returned a verdict: guilty. Leonard Whitfield, age 73, was convicted of taking Patricia Holbrook's life 44 years after the fact. The sentencing hearing was emotional. Patricia's family was finally able to speak, to tell the court about the daughter and sister they had lost, about the 44 years of grief and uncertainty they had endured. They spoke about milestones Patricia had missed, weddings, births, family gatherings. They spoke about the hole in their hearts that could never be filled. Leonard's family also spoke, expressing sorrow for what had happened to Patricia, while maintaining that they couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the crime he had been convicted of. His grandchildren cried, unable to understand how their gentle grandfather could have done something so terrible. Leonard himself was given the opportunity to speak. He stood, an old man in a prison jumpsuit, and for a moment it seemed he might confess, might finally tell the truth about what had happened that foggy October morning. But instead, he He simply said he was sorry for the pain everyone had experienced, carefully avoiding any admission of guilt. Even then, at the end, he couldn't bring himself to fully acknowledge what he had done. The judge sentenced Leonard to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At his age, it was effectively a sentence that he would not outlive. He was led from the courtroom, and the chapter that had begun in 1978 finally closed. But the story didn't end there. Detective Chen continued to work with investigators in Florida and other states, looking at unsolved cases that might be connected to Leonard Whitfield. The DNA evidence from the Jennifer Carson case in Florida came back as a match, confirming what many had suspected. Leonard was charged in that case as well, though given his age and existing sentence, it was more about giving Jennifer's family closure than additional punishment. The case of Rachel Morrison, the woman who disappeared from the Jacksonville Mall in 1989, remained more complicated. Without a body, without physical evidence, connecting Leonard to her disappearance was challenging. But investigators continued to work, hoping that perhaps Leonard might eventually decide to talk, to finally relieve his conscience and tell the truth about all the lives he had touched. The Huntsville community struggled to process what had happened. How could someone live among them for so long, hiding such a terrible secret? How many times had people passed Leonard on the street, never knowing what he had done? It forced a reckoning with the idea that evil doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes it wears a friendly face and lives in a quiet house on a tree-lined street. Patricia's parents established a new initiative in her memory, working with the police department to ensure that cold cases would continue to be reviewed and investigated. They knew their daughter couldn't come back, but perhaps other families might find the answers they deserved. Donald Holbrook passed away 6 months after Leonard's conviction, his wife following him a year later. In their final days, they said they felt a measure of peace, knowing that the man who took their daughter had been found, that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. They were buried alongside Patricia in a cemetery overlooking the Tennessee Valley, the three of them together again. Detective Raymond Foster, the original investigator on Patricia's case, was still alive to see the resolution. He was 91 years old, living in a nursing home, when Detective Chen visited him to tell him about the arrest. He cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief. For 44 years, Patricia's unsolved case had haunted him. The one that got away, the one he couldn't solve. Knowing that modern technology and a dedicated young detective had finally found the answer brought him a peace he hadn't felt in decades. He passed away 3 months later, and Detective Chen attended his funeral, honoring the man whose meticulous evidence preservation had made the eventual solution possible. The case of Patricia Holbrook and Leonard Whitfield taught several important lessons. It demonstrated the critical importance of preserving evidence, even when current technology can't analyze it. The foresight of the 1978 investigators to save biological samples, even though they couldn't be properly tested at the time, was what ultimately solved the case 4 decades later. It showed that justice, while sometimes slow, can eventually prevail. 44 years is a long time to wait, but for Patricia's family and for the community of Huntsville, the wait ended with answers and accountability. The case also highlighted the importance of continued investment in cold case investigation. Detective Chen's work, supported by grant funding and departmental commitment, brought closure not just to Patricia's case, but potentially to others as well. It proved that old cases are never truly hopeless, that new eyes and new technology can breathe life into investigations that seemed dead. Perhaps most significantly, the case served as a reminder that predators often hide in plain sight. Leonard Whitfield wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a member of the community, someone with a job and a family, someone who seemed normal and unremarkable. This realization was both terrifying and important. It reminded people to trust their instincts, to pay attention to warning signs, to understand that danger doesn't always look dangerous. As the years passed after Leonard's conviction, Huntsville slowly absorbed the lessons of Patricia's case. The city continued to grow and thrive, still building rockets, still looking looking toward the future. But it also looked back, honoring the memory of a young librarian who loved books and wanted to help children learn. The library where Patricia worked installed a memorial plaque in her honor. It didn't focus on how she passed, but on how she lived, her kindness, her love of literature, her dedication to her community. Every year on October 14th, the library held a special story hour in her memory, ensuring that new generations would know her name and her story. Leonard Whitfield remains in prison, an old man serving out his final years behind bars. He has never fully confessed to what happened to Patricia, never explained why he did what he did. Some questions, it seems, may never be answered. But the most important question, the one that haunted Huntsville for 44 years, who took Patricia Holbrook's life, finally has an answer. The fog still rolls through the Tennessee Valley on October mornings, thick and gray, making the familiar seem strange. But now, when people in Huntsville see that fog, they don't just think about the cold morning in 1978 when a young woman disappeared. They also think about the spring morning in 2023 when justice finally arrived, when the past caught up with the present, when a cold case became warm again. Patricia Holbrook was 23 years old when her life was cut short. She never got to see the new millennium, never got to hold a smartphone, never got to know a world with the internet and social media. But her story, her memory, and the pursuit of justice in her name touched people across decades and generations. In the end, the case of Patricia Holbrook and Leonard Whitfield is a story about time, how it can obscure the truth but also eventually reveal it, how it can dull pain but never erase it, how it can separate us from our past but never fully disconnect us from it. It's a story about persistence, about investigators who refused to let a case die, about technology that gave voice to evidence that had been silent for decades. Most importantly, it's a story about a young woman who deserved better, who deserved to live the full life that was taken from her on a foggy October morning. While that life can never be restored, her memory serves a purpose. It reminds us to cherish our time, to be vigilant about the safety of those we love, and to never give up on the pursuit of truth and justice. The rockets still fly from Huntsville, reaching for the stars. And somewhere among those stars, one can imagine Patricia Holbrook, the young librarian who loved books, finally at peace, knowing that her story was told, that the truth was found, and that she was never, ever forgotten. The investigation into Leonard Whitfield's other potential crimes continues, a process that may take years to fully resolve. But in Huntsville, Alabama, one case is closed, one family found their answers, and one community learned that even after 4 decades, even when hope seems lost, justice can still find its way home. The library's Children's Story Hour continues every week, young voices filling the space where Patricia once worked, laughter and learning echoing through the halls. It's the legacy she would have wanted, a reminder that even in the darkest stories there can be light, that even when evil tries to extinguish good, the good can endure, can outlast, can ultimately prevail. Huntsville moved forward, carrying Patricia's memory with it, a city that learned that looking toward the future doesn't mean forgetting the past. Sometimes it means honoring it, learning from it, and ensuring that those who were lost are forever remembered. The cold case may have been solved, but the warm memory of Patricia Holbrook's kindness, her smile, her love of helping others continues to shine, a light that 44 years and one man's darkness could never fully extinguish.